Hello, Mr. Welcome to the class. And beautiful Miss, you are also welcome to the class. Have you heard these titles before? Titles like Mr. and Miss? These are some of the common personal titles that you'll hear native speakers use. But oftentimes we make mistakes with using these titles and we end up making them look really rude. So in this lesson with me, Michelle, you're going to find out how to correctly use personal titles.
Subscribe and press the bell icon to receive notifications. Don't miss any new lessons.
Before we get on to using personal titles, let's talk about what specific titles are. So have you heard a title like a captain of a ship, or maybe a doctor? Of course, you won't call a doctor as Mr. So and so, as long as you're going for an appointment. The same way, there are some personal titles that you use for people for whom you don't know the position. If you don't know their position, or maybe at times they are older to you and you want to give them respect. So the whole idea of using personal titles is to give respect to somebody older to you or someone who holds a specific position. So let's look at the first title that you can use for women, and that is Miss. This is a very common title but oftenly wrongly used. So we could always use Miss with the surname Miss Smith. We can also use it with the first name Miss Mary, but which one do you think is correct? So the correct way to use Miss is to use it with the last name and not with the first name. In certain dialects, it's possible that they use the title Miss with the first name, but actually it's incorrect. So try to use Miss with the last name if you're referring to someone. Let's look at the second one that we have. Miss Mary Smith, ABC Company, 444 Oak Street. So where are we using this? Does this look like a formal address to you? Yes, maybe on a postcard or in an email. So this is a formal letter. But did you see the difference? We have used both the first name and the last name. So when you're writing an address, a formal address, you can use both first name and last name with Miss. Let's look at the next one. Formal introductions. Yes, if you're welcoming someone in a party or if you're welcoming a guest of honor, you could say, I'm glad to welcome Miss Mary Smith to the occasion, or I'm glad to welcome Miss Mary Smith to the party. So this is one way of honoring someone. To honor someone. Before we go any further, let's not forget about the men and let's give them some respect as well. So here we have Mr. Johnson and Mr. Jack. As you must have guessed, Mr. Jack is the first name and Mr. Johnson is the last name. The same rule that applies for Miss also applies for Mr. You should prefer to call a person as Mr. Johnson with his last name rather than saying Mr. Jack. So you would want to use their last name. However, if you're writing a formal letter, is it okay to use Mr. and the full name, including the first name and the last name? Yes, it is. So with the formal letter, you can use the full name both with Miss and Mr. Now let's look at formal introductions. Does this rule also apply to Mr.? Can you call out the full name for Mr. Jack Johnson, or should you only call him Mr. Johnson when you're welcoming him in a gathering? Well, I suggest that you call out the full name, because it's absolutely correct to use the full name when you're honoring someone, because if you use the last name, it's a bit disrespectful. So you can use the full name when you're honoring someone. So just like Miss, you could say, I'd like to welcome Mr. Jack Johnson to the gathering. Wonderful. Now let's come back to women. And we have another title for women other than Miss, and that is ma'am. So how common is the use for ma'am? Well, ma'am is most often used when you do not know the name of a particular person, but Miss is usually used when you know someone's name. So ma'am is used when you do not know someone's name. And what is that title that you can use for men if you don't know their name? You can surely call them sir. Yes, sir. I suggest that you do not mix ma'am with lady, because that sounds a bit rude, especially in the UK. You cannot say, may I help you, lady, or excuse me, lady. That is very rude. As it's written here, this is a wrong way of calling out someone and comes forth as really rude. Let's look at this one. May I help you, ma'am? When would you use this? So if you see a stranger and you don't know them at all and you wish to help them, if you see that they're struggling with something, maybe they have a flat tire and you want to help that person, you could say, excuse me, ma'am, or may I help you, ma'am, when someone is struggling. Talking about men, if you refer to a stranger as Mr., excuse me, Mr., again, like lady, that comes forth as very rude. If you choose to be polite, then you'd rather want to say, excuse me, sir, rather than saying, excuse me, Mr., which is a rude word without a name. What about the word miss when you want to refer to someone really young? If you're maybe a 10 years old girl, would you want to call her miss? Well, I don't think that's a great idea, but sometimes you can, and especially if you're writing to someone younger than you, or if you're writing to someone younger in position than you, you can also write M-I-S-S instead of writing miss. This is the correct usage for someone who is younger to you. But if there's someone who is older to you or higher in position, you could use the title Miss. With this, I'd like to mention another point. It's a common practice that when you see someone who is married, you refer to them as Mrs. However, sometimes we are really good at assuming, and if we see someone who is older, we assume that they are married and we might end up calling them Mrs. Smith. But that is really rude. You never know whether they are married or not. So what should we do when we are in this dilemma? You should continue to use the title Miss, which is applicable, and you can use it with married and unmarried women alike. Miss for married and unmarried women. Alike. So now you've learned how to use personal titles. If you're ever struggling with specific titles, or if you don't know the specific title for any individual, then don't think twice. Feel free to use any of these titles, and I'm sure you will not come across as a rude person, because it's good to be polite and it's really good to respect the people around you. come back for more lessons with me. Till then, you take care.